Captain Thesara Krivnik was having what she considered to be a perfectly reasonable diplomatic tea break when Admiral Quobleth decided to ruin her day by laughing at humanity's military capabilities. This was, as these things often are in the galaxy, a spectacular mistake. The galactic diplomatic station orbited peacefully around the twin suns of Meridian Prime, its crystalline spires catching the light in ways that made visiting dignitaries feel appropriately impressed with the universe's commitment to architectural grandeur. Inside Conference Room 17, which had been specifically designed to accommodate beings with anywhere from 2 to 47 limbs, the weekly Interspecies Naval Cooperation Committee meeting was proceeding with all the enthusiasm of a particularly boring funeral. Thesara sat quietly in the corner, sipping her Earl Grey from a regulation Earth Navy mug that read "World's Okayest Captain" in cheerful yellow letters. She wore a simple blue uniform jacket, unremarkable except for the fact that it was slightly too small for her, causing her to keep it unbuttoned. This detail would prove to be monumentally important in approximately 14 minutes and 37 seconds, though none of the assembled delegates had any way of knowing this yet. Admiral Quobleth of the Vraxian Empire was, by all accounts, an impressive specimen of his species. Standing roughly 12 feet tall, with skin that resembled burnished copper and 6 eyes that could independently track different targets, he commanded respect wherever his massive frame cast its shadow. His uniform was a masterpiece of military fashion, adorned with medals, ribbons, and ceremonial weapons that clinked softly as he gestured. The medals alone told the story of a distinguished career: victories against the stellar nomads, successful campaigns in the Outer Rim territories, and his famous tactical victory at the Battle of Azure Point. And so, Quobleth was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been contradicted without serious consequences, we must acknowledge that some species are simply more naturally suited to warfare than others. The Drakmori, for instance, have evolved specifically for combat. Their bone density alone makes them nearly indestructible, and their natural armor plating can deflect energy weapons that would vaporize most other species. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled delegates. The Drakmori representative, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a very angry filing cabinet, nodded approvingly. His name was War Chief Thumpercrack, and he had personally conquered 17 different worlds, using nothing but his natural weapons and an almost supernatural ability to intimidate his enemies into submission. The Zephyrians, Quobleth continued, gesturing toward a graceful being who resembled a cross between a swan and a very elegant chandelier, possess telepathic coordination that allows for flawless fleet maneuvers. They can literally think their ships into perfect formation, sharing tactical information instantaneously across vast distances. The Zephyrian delegate, whose name was something that translated roughly to "harmonious wind that brings victory through perfect understanding," chimed softly in acknowledgement. Her species had never lost a space battle, primarily because they fought as a single, coordinated organism rather than as individual ships. The crystalline collective, Quobleth added, can literally reshape matter at the molecular level during battle. They can turn asteroids into weapons, repair damage instantly, and even transmute enemy projectiles into harmless vapor. More nods, more impressed murmurs. The representative of the crystalline collective, a being that appeared to be made entirely of living diamond and went by the designation primary facet of infinite geometric possibilities, vibrated softly in what passed for agreement among his people. And then Quobleth's voice took on a tone of barely contained amusement. "We have the humans." The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the life support systems and the soft, slurping sound of Thesara drinking her tea. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, though whether this was due to embarrassment for the humans or anticipation of what Quobleth was about to say, was unclear. The humans, Quableth repeated, his 6 eyes now focused on various points around the room, as if he were sharing a particularly good joke, with their soft skin, their single hearts, their laughably primitive technology. They build ships out of metal, ladies and gentlemen. Metal, as if we were still in the Stone Age. A few delegates began to chuckle. The Vraxian Admiral was known for his wit, after all, and his observations about primitive species were often quite entertaining. Why, I heard that their entire fleet consists of barely 300 vessels. 300! My personal escort contains more firepower than their entire navy. Quableth's voice rose with genuine mirth. Honestly, I'm not sure why they were even invited to these meetings. Perhaps as a reminder of how far we've all come. Or maybe as some sort of charity case. The laughter was spreading now, rippling through the room like a wave of superior alien amusement. Even the crystalline collective, who communicated primarily through harmonic vibrations, was producing what could only be described as the sound of wind chimes having a good giggle. Ambassador Plutarch of the tentacled hegemony, a being who resembled a purple octopus that had gone to finishing school, joined in with his own observation. I heard that human weapons are still powered by chemical explosives. Chemical explosives? In the age of quantum disruptors and reality-shearing weaponry. This prompted even more laughter. War Chief Thumpercrack added his own commentary in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed in a cement mixer. Their ships cannot even achieve proper faster-than-light speeds without those ridiculous tunnel jumps. My species was building true warp drives when we were still living in caves. The merriment continued for several more minutes, with various delegates adding their own observations about human technological inadequacy. The consensus seemed to be that humans were a charming but ultimately irrelevant species who had somehow stumbled into space travel through sheer luck. Thesara set down her mug with a soft clink. "Admiral Quableth," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the dying laughter. The Vraxian turned his attention to the small human in the corner, clearly surprised that she had spoken at all. Most humans at these meetings were junior diplomats who spent their time taking notes and trying not to look overwhelmed by the sheer scale of galactic politics. "Yes, Captain." He consulted his datapad, which immediately provided him with her service record, or rather, it provided him with what he thought was her service record. The actual file was classified at a level that would have made several galactic intelligence agencies very nervous. "Krivnik, isn't it? Did you have something to add to our discussion?" Thesara stood up slowly, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from her uniform. She was a relatively small woman by human standards, standing barely 5.5 feet tall, with brown hair that she kept in a regulation military bun, and eyes that were a peculiar shade of green. She looked, in other words, like exactly the sort of person you would expect to find managing a filing system rather than commanding a starship. "Oh, not really," she said with a smile that was perfectly pleasant and completely terrifying, in a way that none of the assembled delegates quite understood yet. "Just wondering if you'd like to see something interesting." Before Quableth could respond, she casually opened her jacket wider. The laughter in the room died, as if someone had suddenly evacuated all the air. Pinned to the inside of Thesara's jacket, in neat, precise rows, were kill markers. Not medals, not ribbons, not ceremonial decorations. Kill markers, the kind that naval officers traditionally used to track enemy vessels they had personally destroyed. The kind that most officers accumulated perhaps 1 or 2 of during distinguished careers spanning decades. There were a lot of them. "Holy gravitational anomalies," whispered War Chief Thumpercrack, his voice crackling like static electricity mixed with genuine terror. Thesara's jacket contained 47 small silver stars, each representing a single enemy vessel. These were arranged in 7 neat rows, with the precision of someone who took great pride in their organizational skills. Beneath them, in a row that made several delegates' breathing systems malfunction, were 12 larger golden stars. fleet kills, each one representing not just a ship, but an entire enemy fleet. But it was the row beneath those that made Ambassador Plutarch's tentacles go completely limp with shock. 3 platinum stars, each the size of a human thumb. Those represented something that most galactic military historians considered to be theoretically impossible: the destruction of an entire enemy civilization's military capacity. Oh, these... Thesara glanced down at her jacket with the casual air of someone who had just noticed they were wearing socks. Yeah, I should probably get a bigger jacket. Running out of room, you know. The quartermaster keeps telling me that regulation jackets aren't supposed to be used as trophy displays, but honestly, where else am I supposed to put them? The silence in the room was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop, assuming pins made any sound when dropped in artificial gravity, which they didn't, making the silence even more profound and somewhat philosophical in its implications. Admiral Quobleth's 6 eyes were now all focused on the same point, specifically the inside of Thesara's jacket. His mouth, which had been curved in an amused smile moments before, was now hanging open in a way that suggested his brain had temporarily forgotten how to operate basic facial muscles. The expression on his face was reminiscent of someone who had just been told that the laws of physics were merely friendly suggestions. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice considerably smaller than it had been a moment ago, "but are those actual kill markers?" "Depends on your definition of actual," Thesara replied, rebuttoning her jacket with the same casual precision she might use to adjust her hair. "If you mean representing real enemy vessels that I personally sent to whatever passes for heaven in their respective belief systems, then yes, absolutely. If you mean little pieces of metal that I bought at a novelty shop to impress people at parties, then no, definitely not." The Zephyrian delegate, whose name was far too complex for most beings to pronounce, began making the high-pitched keening noise that her species produced when experiencing extreme psychological distress. It was a sound not unlike a smoke detector having an existential crisis. But you're human," Quobleth stammered, as if this fact alone should have prevented the existence of what he had just seen. "Humans don't... You can't... That's not..." "Guilty as charged," Thesara agreed pleasantly. "Born and raised on Earth, in the great state of Montana. Lovely place, very peaceful. Lots of cows. Though I should mention that these kill markers are just from my current posting. I had to start fresh when I made captain. Naval regulations, you understand. Can't have junior officers getting intimidated by their commanding officer's service record." The crystalline collective had stopped vibrating entirely, which was their equivalent of fainting. Primary facet of infinite geometric possibilities was now producing no harmonic resonance whatsoever, which in his species' culture was considered to be a sign of either deep meditation or complete psychological breakdown. "Current posting?" War Chief Thumpercrack's voice had risen to a squeak, which was particularly disturbing coming from a being who usually sounded like an earthquake having a disagreement with a volcano. "You mean there are more?" "Oh, considerably more," Thesara confirmed, settling back into her chair and picking up her tea mug. She took a thoughtful sip before continuing. "Let's see. There were the 43 ships I destroyed as a lieutenant commander, the 78 as a commander, and the 116 as a lieutenant. Plus the various special operations that don't officially appear on any records because they're classified at levels that would make your respective intelligence agencies very unhappy." She paused, apparently doing mental arithmetic. "Actually, now that I think about it, I'm probably approaching the 1,000 mark pretty soon. The Admiral's office has a betting pool going about when I'll hit 4 digits. I think Lieutenant Jameson has his money on next Thursday." The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to be actively hostile to the concept of sound itself. "But let's not dwell on the past," Thesara continued brightly. "Admiral Quobleth, You were saying something about the primitive nature of human naval technology. Quobleth's copper skin had taken on a distinctly greenish tinge, which in Vraxian physiology was usually associated with either severe nausea or the contemplation of one's own mortality. I think there may have been some sort of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding at all, Thesara said, with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing weekend hobbies. You're absolutely correct. We do build our ships out of metal, mostly steel actually, with some titanium reinforcement in the critical areas and a few ceramic composites where we need heat resistance. Terribly primitive stuff, really. She took another sip of her tea, apparently savoring both the beverage and the moment. Of course, there are advantages to primitive technology. For instance, when your enemy's weapons are designed to disrupt sophisticated energy matrices and quantum-entangled targeting systems, they tend to have a bit of trouble with something as simple as a big metal tube full of very angry humans and enough nuclear explosives to sterilize a small moon. The room was now so quiet that the life support systems seemed to be holding their breath out of respect for the profound nature of what was being discussed. The hegemony of Corvash learned this the hard way, Thesara continued conversationally. Lovely species, the Corvashians, 8 feet tall, natural armor, plating that could stop plasma bolts, weapons that could slice through diamond like it was warm butter. Their fleet was a marvel of engineering, ships that could phase in and out of normal space, weapons that fired concentrated dark energy, shields that could deflect anything short of a supernova. She paused to take another sip of tea, apparently lost in fond memories. Beautiful ships, really. The hull plating had this sort of iridescent quality that shifted colors depending on the angle of observation. And the way they move, like dancers, really. Very graceful, almost a shame to blow them up. Ambassador Plutarch had begun making a sound like a tea kettle that was questioning its life choices. They lasted about 47 minutes against my squadron, Thesara continued, with the tone of someone discussing a mildly interesting sporting event. Turns out, when you're used to fighting enemies with sophisticated defensive systems, you're not quite prepared for humans who respond to your impressive dark energy weapons by ramming a metal ship full of nuclear explosives directly into your hull at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The Zephyrian delegate's keening had risen to a pitch that was causing the crystalline walls to vibrate in sympathy, creating an eerie harmonic effect that made everyone in the room feel vaguely nauseous. The Corvashians sent a formal complaint to the Galactic Council, Thesara added, apparently finding this detail amusing. Said we were fighting unsportingly, claimed that ramming attacks violated the spirit of civilized warfare. The Council's response was to officially classify human naval tactics as creative problem-solving, and to suggest that maybe the Corvashians should have read our species file more carefully before starting a war with us. Admiral Quobleth seemed to be having trouble with basic motor functions. His 6 eyes were blinking in a pattern that suggested his brain was trying to reboot itself, possibly from a backup stored in his secondary nervous system. But the report said, he began, then stopped, apparently realizing that whatever reports he had been reading were dramatically insufficient for understanding the true nature of human military capabilities. Oh, you mean the official reports? Thesara asked with the sort of innocent expression that immediately made everyone in the room very suspicious. Yes, those tend to be a bit sanitized, diplomatic relations and all that. Can't have everyone knowing that humans consider impossible odds to be a personal challenge rather than a reason to retreat. It would make trade negotiations very awkward. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly interesting piece of gossip with close friends. Take the Battle of Zirian Nebula, for instance. Beautiful nebula, really. All sorts of gorgeous colors, purples and blues, and these lovely golden streamers that caught the light from the nearby star system. Shame about what happened to it, but these things do happen in wartime. The Drakmori representative made a sound like a garbage disposal, trying to process a piano that was having philosophical doubts about its existence. The Dominion of Thrakis thought they were being terribly clever, hiding their entire invasion fleet in the nebula's sensor-dampening fields. 237 ships, if I remember correctly. Quite impressive, really. Their plan was to wait until our patrol ships had passed by, then emerge from hiding and attack our supply convoys. Excellent strategy, very logical. She paused, apparently lost in thought. The problem, Thessara continued, was that they were thinking like civilized beings. They assumed that no sane military commander would intentionally detonate a stellar conversion device inside a nebula, because the resulting gravitational cascade would destroy everything within a 3-light-year radius, including any ships that happened to be hiding inside. She smiled, and several delegates suddenly felt the urge to check their life insurance policies and possibly update their wills. They were absolutely right, of course. No sane military commander would do such a thing. The environmental damage alone would be catastrophic. Fortunately, I've never claimed to be entirely sane, and the Admiralty has learned to stop asking awkward questions about my methods as long as I get results. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to bend space-time around itself, creating a small pocket of reality where the concept of rational thought went to die. You destroyed an entire nebula. Quobleth's voice was barely a whisper, like the sound wind makes when it's trying very hard not to disturb anything important. Oh, not just the nebula, Thessara corrected with the sort of helpful precision that made everyone wish she would be less precise. The nebula, the invasion fleet, a rather unfortunate merchant convoy that happened to be passing through at exactly the wrong moment, and about 47% of the Thrakis star system's outer asteroid belt. The gravitational effects were quite spectacular, really. The resulting light show was visible from 12 different star systems. The crystalline collective had begun producing a low, mournful harmonic that sounded like a funeral dirge for the concept of rational military strategy. We sent a very nice apology letter to the Merchant Guild, Thessara added thoughtfully. With flowers, Admiral Patricia always says that flowers make everything better, and she's usually right about these things. The Guild was quite understanding, actually. They filed for compensation through the standard wartime damages procedures and sent us a thank you note for eliminating their Thrakis shipping competition. Ambassador Plutarch was now staring at Thessara with the expression of someone who had just realized they were sharing a room with a natural disaster that had somehow learned to make small talk. The Dominion of Thrakis, Thessara continued, filed a war crimes complaint with the Galactic Council, claimed that destroying stellar phenomena during wartime violated 17 different interstellar treaties. The Council reviewed the case for about 6 months. Very thorough, those Council investigators, and concluded that since there's no specific law against destroying stellar phenomena during wartime, it was technically legal. She took another sip of her tea, apparently considering the philosophical implications of galactic law. They did ask us to give 48 hours notice before doing it again, though. Professional courtesy and all that. Something about giving civilian traffic time to clear the area. Very reasonable, really. Admiral Quobleth's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his own beverage, a complex Vraxian stimulant that was supposed to enhance cognitive function and promote clear thinking. He took a large gulp and immediately began coughing, apparently having forgotten that the beverage was considerably stronger than he was used to. "I think," he said when he had recovered his voice and some measure of his composure, "that there may have been some significant gaps in our intelligence regarding human military capabilities." "Oh, there usually are," Thessara agreed cheerfully, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Most species assume that because we're not naturally armored, telepathic, or capable of manipulating matter at the atomic level, we must be militarily inferior. It's a perfectly logical conclusion, really. A reasonable being would look at human physiology and assume that we're not cut out for warfare. She finished her tea and set the mug down with finality, the small clink echoing in the silent room like a judge's gavel. What they tend to overlook is that being physically disadvantaged tends to make a species really good at finding creative solutions to problems. When you can't win through superior firepower or advanced technology, you learn to win through superior audacity and a complete disregard for conventional military wisdom. The Zephyrian delegate had stopped keening and was now staring at Thesara with the fixed intensity of someone trying to determine if they were looking at a military genius or a complete lunatic, and gradually coming to the terrifying conclusion that it might be both. "Take the siege of Fortress Gamma 7, Thesara continued, apparently warming to her subject. The hegemony of Corvash had built this massive orbital fortress 10 miles across, shields that could deflect a planet-killer weapon, enough firepower to sterilize a solar system. They were using it as a staging ground for their invasion of the Tau Ceti system." She paused, apparently lost in thought as she recalled the details. Beautiful piece of engineering, really. The Corvashians had spent 3 centuries perfecting the design. It was supposed to be absolutely impregnable. That was actually the advertising slogan they used when they were trying to sell the design to other species. Fortress Gamma 7, absolutely impregnable. They even had it embroidered on the uniforms. Admiral Quobleth was now leaning forward despite himself, caught between horror and fascination, like someone watching a traffic accident involving several star destroyers and a small planet. The defensive systems alone were a work of art, Thesara continued. Automated turrets that could track 1 million separate targets simultaneously, energy barriers that could stop anything short of a black hole, point defense networks that could intercept individual photons if necessary, and a garrison of 50,000 elite warriors who had been trained from birth to defend the fortress. She stood up and began pacing slightly, her hands clasped behind her back in the universal pose of someone explaining something that made perfect sense to them, but might require some effort for others to understand. The Corvashians were quite proud of it, really. They invited military observers from dozens of species to tour the facility. There were academic papers written about its defensive capabilities. One Quantum University professor called it the most perfect example of military engineering in the known galaxy. War Chief Thumpercrack was making a sound like a cement mixer trying to process its own feelings. How did you—" he began, then apparently decided that he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Oh, we didn't attack it," Thesara said brightly, as if this should have been obvious. "That would have been silly. You don't attack an impregnable fortress. That's the whole point of making it impregnable. Instead, we stole it." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have its own gravitational field, drawing in nearby concepts like rational thought and basic understanding of reality, and crushing them into a singularity of pure confusion. "You stole a 10-mile-wide fortress." The Drakmori representative's voice cracked like ice under pressure, then immediately apologized to itself for the undignified display. "Well, stole might be the wrong word," Thesara mused, apparently giving the matter serious consideration. "More like borrowed without permission, and then accidentally crashed it into the Corvashian home fleet. These things happen when you're operating military equipment that you haven't had time to read the instruction manual for." She resumed her pacing, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share the story with an appreciative audience. The key was understanding that the Corvashians, being a highly logical and methodical species, had designed their fortress to be completely secure against external threats. They had spent centuries anticipating every possible form of attack from the outside: asteroid impacts, Nova-class weaponry, coordinated fleet assaults, reality-warping technology, you name it. Ambassador Plutarch was now making a sound like a tea kettle that had achieved enlightenment and immediately regretted it. What they hadn't anticipated, Thesara continued, was someone boarding the fortress, walking up to the central command center, knocking politely on the door, and asking to speak to the manager. Admiral Quobleth's 6 eyes were now blinking in perfect synchronization, which according to his species' medical literature was a sign of either extreme stress or the onset of a rare neurological condition that usually required immediate hospitalization. "You walked up to the command center?" "Well, first, we had to get past the 50,000 elite warriors," Thesara admitted, with the sort of casual tone usually reserved for discussing minor inconveniences like traffic delays or unexpected rain. "That took about 3 hours, which was actually longer than we had anticipated. Those Corvassian warriors really were quite good, very professional, excellent training, top-notch equipment." The Zephyrian delegate made a sound like a smoke detector having an existential crisis about the nature of existence. The problem was that they had been trained to fight other Corvassians, or at least beings who fought like Corvassians. You know, honorable combat, established tactics, weapons that behaved in predictable ways. They weren't quite prepared for humans who consider fighting fair to be a contradiction in terms. She paused in her pacing to examine a small scratch on her uniform sleeve, apparently considering whether it was worth worrying about. "After we had dealt with the garrison, we had to figure out how to operate Corvassian technology, which was actually the hard part. Have you ever tried to read an instruction manual that was written by beings who communicate primarily through changes in electromagnetic field polarity? It's surprisingly complex, especially when you're trying to do it while the fortress's security systems are attempting to sterilize you with concentrated antimatter." The crystalline collective had begun producing harmonics that sounded like a choir of angels having a nervous breakdown. "But once we got the hang of it," Thesara continued, "the rest was straightforward. We simply programmed the fortress to fly itself into the middle of the Corvassian home fleet, and then activated the self-destruct sequence. Very efficient. The explosion was visible from 14 light-years away and temporarily disrupted hyperspace traffic throughout the sector." She sat back down and picked up her empty mug, examining it with the air of someone who was mildly disappointed that it didn't contain more tea. "The Corvassians filed another complaint, of course, said we had violated the Geneva Convention. The Council pointed out that the Geneva Convention was a human document and therefore didn't apply to alien fortresses. The Corvassians then tried to invoke the Galactic Treaty on Acceptable Warfare, but it turns out there's no specific clause prohibiting the theft of enemy installations." Admiral Quobleth was now staring at Thesara with the expression of someone who had just realized they were sharing a room with a natural disaster disguised as a person who made excellent tea. "The Council," Thesara added, "did suggest that in the future we should try to return any stolen enemy installations in roughly the same condition we found them. We pointed out that this would be difficult, given that we had just converted them into rapidly expanding clouds of superheated plasma, but we promised to keep it in mind for future reference." The room had taken on the quality of a morgue, if morgues were filled with living beings who were seriously reconsidering their life choices and wondering if it was too late to pursue careers in accounting or flower arrangement. "Admiral Quobleth," Thesara said, turning to face the Vraxian directly with the sort of pleasant smile that made everyone in the room want to hide under their respective furniture. "You mentioned earlier that your personal escort contains more firepower than our entire fleet. That's probably true. Your ships are certainly more advanced than ours, better armed, better shielded, and operated by a species that has evolved specifically for warfare." Quobleth nodded slowly, though he no longer seemed particularly proud of this fact. In fact, he was beginning to wonder if superior firepower was really as important as he had previously believed. "The thing is," Thesara continued with the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a small child, "firepower isn't everything. The Corvassians had more firepower than us too. So did the Dominion of Thrakis. So did the crystalline hegemony. The Void Walkers, the eternal empire of Zefkorth, and the transcendent machines of Proxima Beta. She paused, letting this sink in while various delegates contemplated the implications of her casual mention of species that had been galactic superpowers. They all had better ships, better weapons, better technology, and considerably more experience with interstellar warfare. And they're all now footnotes in military history textbooks, usually in chapters titled "What Not to Do When Fighting Humans" or "The Importance of Reading Species Files Before Declaring War." The crystalline collective had begun producing a sound like wind chimes being slowly crushed by a steamroller that was questioning its career choices. "The problem," Thesara explained, standing up again to resume her pacing, "is that most species approach warfare like it's a chess game. They make logical moves, they follow established strategies, they fight according to accepted rules and conventions. This works perfectly well when you're fighting other logical, rule-following species who can be expected to behave in predictable ways." She paused at the room's large viewport, gazing out at the twin suns of Meridian Prime with the expression of someone contemplating the fundamental nature of existence, or possibly just wondering what was for lunch. Humans, on the other hand, approach warfare like it's a game of Calvin Ball, where the rules are made up as we go along and the only objective is to win by any means necessary. This tends to confuse our enemies, who keep expecting us to do the logical thing instead of something completely insane that somehow works anyway. Admiral Quobleth was now gripping his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, or at least whatever color Vraxian knuckles turned when their owners were experiencing extreme stress and a profound reconsideration of their understanding of reality. "The Battle of Proxima Station is a perfect example," Thesara continued, apparently settling into a comfortable storytelling rhythm. "The Void Walkers had surrounded the station with their entire fleet, 600 ships, all equipped with phase-shift weaponry that could ignore conventional shielding and reality distortion fields that made targeting them nearly impossible." She paused to check her watch, a simple mechanical device that looked laughably primitive compared to the quantum chronometers worn by the other delegates, but somehow managed to convey an air of quiet competence. The Void Walkers were quite proud of their technology. They had spent millennia perfecting the art of existing partially outside normal space-time, which made them effectively invulnerable to conventional weapons. Their ships could phase in and out of reality at will, strike without warning, and disappear before their enemies could respond. War Chief Thumpercrack was now making a sound like a cement mixer, having a nervous breakdown while contemplating the meaninglessness of existence. "They demanded our surrender, pointing out quite reasonably that resistance was futile and that they had us outnumbered 10-1. Their weapons couldn't be stopped by our shields, our own shields couldn't protect us from their weapons, and we had no hope of reinforcement arriving in time to make any difference." The room was now so quiet that you could hear individual molecules moving around, possibly looking for somewhere else to be. "The Void Walkers," she continued, "were absolutely right. Resistance was futile. We were outnumbered 10-1. Our weapons couldn't penetrate their phase-shifted hulls. Our own defensive systems were completely useless against their reality distortion technology. And the nearest friendly fleet was 3 days away at maximum speed. The Drakmori representative was now making a sound like a cement mixer, having a nervous breakdown, while simultaneously questioning the basic assumptions underlying rational thought. "So we surrendered," Thesara said brightly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The room seemed to exhale collectively, various delegates feeling a moment of relief that at least this story would end with something resembling sanity. "And then," she added with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm usually reserved for announcing surprise parties, "while they were busy accepting our surrender and preparing to board the station, we activated the emergency beacon that we had hidden in the surrender transmission." The collective exhale immediately reversed itself, creating a sort of atmospheric hiccup that made everyone feel slightly dizzy. "The beacon," Thesara explained with the patient tone of someone describing a perfectly obvious solution to a simple problem, was programmed to emit a signal that convinced every Void Walker ship that every other Void Walker ship was actually a human vessel in disguise. Their own targeting systems, which had been designed to automatically engage any human vessel on sight, immediately began firing on each other. She smiled, and several delegates made mental notes to never ever accept a surrender from a human without first conducting a thorough investigation of any accompanying transmissions. The beautiful thing about automated targeting systems, Thesara continued, is that they're very efficient. They don't waste time with things like independent verification or double-checking sensor readings or asking questions before shooting. They just see a target that matches their parameters and immediately open fire with everything they have. Ambassador Plutarch was now staring at Thesara with the expression of someone who had just realized that the universe was far more terrifying than he had previously imagined, and that the most terrifying thing in it was currently explaining military tactics with the enthusiasm of someone discussing their favorite hobby. The Void Walkers spent the next 4 hours shooting their own fleet to pieces while we sat safely inside the station, drinking coffee and taking bets on which ship would explode next. Lieutenant Morrison won the pool. She had correctly predicted that the flagship would be the last to realize what was happening and would therefore survive longest before being destroyed by its own escorts. Admiral Quableth's 6 eyes were now all focused on different points in space, as if they were trying to flee from his head and find somewhere less psychologically damaging to exist. By the time they figured out what was happening, Thesara continued, they had destroyed 80% of their own fleet. The remaining ships were so damaged and demoralized that they sent us a formal apology for disturbing our afternoon and asked if they could possibly surrender to us instead. She paused, apparently savoring the memory. We accepted their surrender, of course, professional courtesy and all that. And then we sent them home with a message for their high command explaining that if they ever bothered us again, we would do something really creative, something that would make the fake surrender beacon look like amateur hour. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to be actively absorbing sound from other dimensions and converting it into pure psychological trauma. They filed a complaint too, Thesara added, apparently finding this detail endlessly amusing. Said we had violated the Galactic Convention on Honorable Surrender. The Council reviewed the case and concluded that since we had technically surrendered first, everything that happened afterward was just an unfortunate misunderstanding brought about by incompatible technological systems. The Zephyrian delegate was now staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who was seriously considering the benefits of a career change, possibly to something safe and predictable like diffusing antimatter bombs or wrestling black holes. The Council, Thesara continued, did suggest that in the future we should try to make our surrender transmissions less explosive. We pointed out that this would take all the fun out of surrendering, but we promised to consider it for diplomatic purposes. Admiral Quableth finally managed to speak, though his voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance, possibly from another dimension where things made more sense. Captain Krivnik, he said slowly, as if each word required considerable effort to produce, I believe I may have made a serious error in judgment. Oh, I wouldn't worry about it, Thesara replied cheerfully, waving her hand in a dismissive gesture that somehow managed to be both reassuring and vaguely threatening at the same time. Happens all the time. Just last week, the Eternal Empire of Zephkorth made the same mistake. They sent a delegation to Earth, demanding that we surrender our entire fleet to them as tribute. She paused, apparently savoring the memory with the expression of someone recalling a particularly entertaining comedy show. The delegation arrived during Fleet Week, which was either the worst possible timing or the best possible timing, depending on your perspective. They landed their ceremonial barge right in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by about 300 human warships that were participating in the annual naval review, and demanded to speak to whoever was in charge of our pathetic excuse for a navy. The crystalline collective had begun producing a sound like a choir of angels having a panic attack while simultaneously questioning the fundamental nature of reality. The admiral in charge of the ceremony, Thesara continued, was Admiral Patricia Stormwind. Lovely woman. Grandmother of 6, makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the Sol system, grows prize-winning roses in her spare time, and has personally sent more enemy fleets to their respective afterlives than any other human in recorded history. She began pacing again, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share one of her favorite stories with an appreciative audience. Admiral Stormwind has this remarkable ability to look completely harmless right up until the moment she orders the complete annihilation of everything within a 12-light-year radius. It's quite impressive, really. She has this gentle grandmother voice that she uses for everything from discussing cookie recipes to ordering planetary bombardments. Ambassador Plutarch was now making a sound like a tea kettle that had achieved enlightenment and immediately decided that ignorance was much more comfortable. The Zefkorth delegation was led by Supreme Commander Vex Thulan the Conqueror, a being who had subjugated 47 different species and whose name was whispered in terror across 17 star systems. He was 12 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating that could deflect starship weapons, and carried ceremonial weapons that could slice through a battlecruiser's hull. Admiral Quobleth was now making a sound like a deflating balloon that was having second thoughts about its career in party entertainment. Supreme Commander Vex Thulan, Thesara continued, looked at Admiral Stormwind, a 5-foot-tall grandmother in a navy dress uniform who was holding a plate of cookies, and laughed. He actually laughed. Said that if this was the best that humanity could offer, the conquest of Earth would be even easier than he had anticipated. She stopped pacing and turned to face the assembled delegates, her expression taking on the sort of fond smile usually reserved for discussing beloved pets or favorite childhood memories. Admiral Stormwind, she said, smiled politely, offered the Supreme Commander a cookie. They were chocolate chip, her specialty, and thanked him for his interest in Earth's military capabilities. Then she asked if he would like to see a demonstration of human naval technology. The room was now so quiet that you could hear the universe expanding, and it seemed to be doing so very nervously. The demonstration, Thesara continued, lasted exactly 37 seconds. By the time it was over, the entire Zefkorth fleet, 243 ships representing the combined military might of an empire that had conquered half a galaxy, had been reduced to rapidly expanding clouds of superheated plasma that were already beginning to form interesting nebula patterns. She paused, apparently considering how to explain what had happened in terms that wouldn't cause immediate psychological damage to her audience. The eternal empire of Zefkorth, she said finally, had made the same mistake that most species make when dealing with humans. They assumed that because our technology looks primitive, it must be less effective than their own. What they didn't realize is that human military technology is designed with one primary goal in mind: killing things as efficiently and spectacularly as possible. The Drakmori representative was now staring at Thesara with the expression of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of a force of nature that had learned to make small talk and serve tea. Zefkorth weapons, Thesara explained, were designed to be elegant, efficient, and precise. They could slice through armor plating with surgical precision, disable enemy ships without destroying them, and were powered by clean, renewable energy sources that had minimal environmental impact. She smiled, and several delegates began to sweat despite the perfectly controlled environmental systems and the fact that some of them didn't actually have sweat glands. Human weapons, she continued with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing favorite hobbies, are designed to turn enemy ships into constituent atoms as quickly and violently as possible. We don't care about elegance or efficiency or environmental impact. We care about making sure that when we shoot at something, it stops existing in any meaningful sense of the word. Admiral Quobleth was now gripping his chair so tightly that hairline cracks were appearing in the armrests, which was particularly impressive given that they were made of a titanium carbide composite that was supposedly indestructible. The Supreme Commander, Thesara continued, spent his last few seconds of life realizing that he had just challenged a species that considers overkill to be a suggestion rather than a criticism. His final transmission was a formal apology to Admiral Stormwind for having disturbed her afternoon and a request for the cookie recipe. The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to be actively hostile to the concept of sound, thought, and possibly existence itself. Admiral Stormwind, Thesara added, accepted the apology graciously and sent the Supreme Commander's personal effects back to his family, with a note expressing her condolences and the complete recipe for chocolate chip cookies, including her secret ingredient, which is a tablespoon of vanilla extract. The Zephyrian delegate had begun making a sound like a broken smoke detector that was having an existential crisis about the nature of its purpose in the universe. The Eternal Empire of Zefkorth, Thesara continued, filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Council claiming that humanity had violated the Convention on Proportional Response. The Council reviewed the case for several months and concluded that since the Zefkorth delegation had technically declared war on humanity first, Admiral Stormwind's response was completely justified under galactic law. She sat back down and looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just finished explaining something perfectly obvious and was wondering why everyone looked so confused. The Council, she added, did suggest that in the future we should try to give enemy delegates more than 37 seconds to reconsider their position. We pointed out that 37 seconds was actually quite generous, considering that our standard response time is usually measured in microseconds, but we agreed to consider extending it to a full minute for diplomatic purposes. Admiral Quobleth's 6 eyes were now all staring at the same point on the table, as if he were trying to bore a hole through it with the power of his gaze and escape to a dimension where military conflicts made sense. "Captain Krivnik," he said very quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe I owe you an apology." "Oh, not at all," Thesara replied brightly, waving her hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but somehow managed to be vaguely ominous. "Perfectly understandable mistake. Most species make the same assumption when they first encounter humans. We're used to it by now." She stood up and began collecting her things, including her mug and a small data pad that she had apparently been reading before the meeting began. The data pad, several delegates noticed with growing alarm, appeared to be displaying what looked like tactical readouts and fleet deployment schedules. "The thing is," she continued conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather or recent sports scores, "humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We've gotten quite good at it. When we finally made it to space and discovered that the galaxy was full of other species, we were absolutely delighted to find new opponents to test our skills against. The crystalline collective had begun producing a sound like a xylophone being fed through a wood chipper that was questioning its life choices. Most species, Thesara explained, develop space travel and then spend their time exploring, trading, and building peaceful civilizations. They use their newfound abilities to advance science, improve quality of life, and foster understanding between different cultures." She paused to put on her jacket, carefully buttoning it so that the kill markers were once again hidden from view, though everyone in the room was now acutely aware of what lay beneath the innocent-looking blue fabric. "Humans," she continued, "developed space travel and immediately began figuring out how to use it for military purposes. The first thing we did after achieving faster-than-light travel was start a war with ourselves to test out the new technology. Admiral Quobleth was now staring at Thesara with the expression of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of a species that treated warfare as a recreational activity and had somehow managed to become very, very good at it. The first human space battle, she continued, took place less than 6 months after we achieved faster-than-light travel. It was fought between two human factions who were arguing about mining rights in the asteroid belt. The battle lasted 14 hours and ended with both sides completely destroying each other in a spectacular display of mutual annihilation. She picked up her datapad and checked the time, apparently satisfied with whatever she saw there. The interesting thing, Thesara continued, was that both sides considered it a successful engagement. They had gotten to test their new weapons, try out some innovative tactics, gather valuable combat data, and had generally enjoyed themselves right up until the moment they were vaporized. War Chief Thumpercrack was now making a sound like a garbage disposal, trying to process a set of wind chimes that were having philosophical doubts about the nature of music. Other species, she explained, build their military forces to defend their territory and protect their people. It's a logical, rational approach to the problem of security in a dangerous universe. She moved toward the door, clearly preparing to leave, though everyone in the room was desperately hoping she would stay just long enough to explain how they could avoid becoming part of her kill marker collection. Humans, Thesara continued, build military forces because we enjoy the challenge. The fact that we occasionally use them to defend our territory is really just a pleasant side effect of our primary hobby, which is finding new and creative ways to blow things up. She paused at the door, turning back to face the assembled delegates with the sort of pleasant smile that made everyone want to hide under their chairs and possibly emigrate to a different galaxy. This, she added, tends to give us a significant advantage in combat. When you're fighting someone who considers warfare to be a fun, recreational activity, you're at a serious disadvantage if you're trying to fight logically and rationally. Ambassador Plutarch had begun making a sound like a tea kettle that had achieved enlightenment, rejected it as too stressful, and decided to pursue a career in meditation instead. Admiral Quobleth, she said, addressing the still stunned Vraxian directly, I hope this has been educational. Please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions about human military capabilities. I'm always happy to discuss the subject with interested colleagues. She paused, apparently considering whether to add anything else. Oh, and Admiral, she added with the sort of helpful tone usually reserved for giving directions or suggesting restaurants. Next time you're planning to mock someone's military record, you might want to check their service file first. It can save you a lot of embarrassment and possibly prevent you from accidentally insulting someone who has personally destroyed more enemy fleets than your entire species has ever fielded. With that, she walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to be actively hostile to the concept of thought, speech, and possibly consciousness itself. Admiral Quobleth sat in his chair for a long time, staring at the door through which Captain Thesara Krivnik had just exited. His 6 eyes were now all focused on the same point, and his breathing had the irregular quality of someone who was trying to process information that didn't fit into any of his existing mental categories. The other delegates remained equally motionless, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they had just witnessed. The crystalline collective had stopped producing any sound whatsoever, which in their culture was either a sign of deep philosophical contemplation or complete psychological shutdown. Finally, Admiral Quobleth turned to his aide, a young Vraxian officer who had been taking notes throughout the meeting and was now staring at his datapad with the expression of someone who wasn't sure if he should file what he had just witnessed under diplomatic proceedings or existential horror. Lieutenant Vex Kalar, Quobleth said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir, the lieutenant replied, his stylus poised over his datapad with the sort of mechanical precision that suggested his conscious mind had temporarily vacated the premises. "I want you to send a message to High Command immediately," Quableth continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was very carefully choosing his words. "Yes, sir." "What should the message say?" "Tell them," Quableth said, pausing to consider the exact phrasing, "that our intelligence assessments regarding human military capabilities may have been inadequate." "Inadequate, sir." The lieutenant looked up from his datapad with a confused expression. "Catastrophically, monumentally, apocalyptically inadequate," Quableth clarified, his voice gaining strength as he found the words to express the magnitude of the problem. "Tell them that we need to immediately revise every single assumption we have ever made about human military doctrine, technology, and tactical philosophy." "All of them, sir?" "All of them," Quableth confirmed. "Also, cancel all planned military exercises in the Sol system. In fact, cancel all planned military operations within 50 light-years of any human-controlled space." "All of them, sir?" The lieutenant's voice had risen to a squeak. "All of them," Quableth repeated firmly. "And, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir. Send a formal apology to the human delegation, with flowers, very expensive flowers, the kind that say, 'We are deeply sorry for our profound ignorance and would very much like to avoid being turned into constituent atoms.'" The lieutenant looked up from his datapad with a confused expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to categorize this type of diplomatic correspondence. "Flowers, sir? What kind of flowers?" "I don't care," Quableth replied, his voice taking on a slightly hysterical edge. "Whatever kind humans like. Ask the cultural attaché. Better yet, ask Captain Krivnik directly. I'm sure she'll have suggestions." As the various delegates began to file out of the conference room, each of them carrying the stunned expression of someone who had just discovered that their fundamental assumptions about the universe were completely wrong, Admiral Quableth remained seated, staring at the empty doorway. War Chief Thumpercrack paused on his way out, his massive frame casting a shadow across Quableth's chair. "Admiral," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, "I believe we may need to reconsider our entire approach to interspecies relations." "Yes," Quableth replied without looking up, "I believe we may." Ambassador Plutarch slithered past, his tentacles moving with the careful precision of someone who was trying very hard not to attract attention. "Admiral," he whispered, "do you think she was telling the truth about the kill markers?" Quableth finally looked up, his 6 eyes focusing on the ambassador with the sort of grim certainty that comes from having one's worldview completely shattered and rebuilt in the space of an hour. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "I have the terrible feeling that she was being modest." As the last of the delegates filed out, leaving Admiral Quableth alone with his aide and his rapidly expanding understanding of just how dangerous the universe really was, he began to understand why the Galactic Council had been so insistent on including humans in these diplomatic meetings. It wasn't because they wanted to be inclusive, or because they felt sorry for a primitive species that was still learning to navigate galactic politics. It was because they were absolutely terrified of what might happen if they didn't. The universe, Admiral Quableth realized, was a much more dangerous place than he had previously imagined, and the most dangerous thing in it was currently walking down the corridor outside, whistling a cheerful tune that sounded suspiciously like an old Earth song about the futility of war, and thinking about where to get a decent cup of tea and possibly a sandwich. Somewhere in the depths of space, the remnants of 47 different enemy fleets drifted silently through the void, their atoms scattered across light-years of empty space, serving as a monument to the galaxy's most important lesson. Never, ever underestimate a species that considers impossible odds to be a personal invitation to get creative. But more importantly, never underestimate a species that has learned to package unthinkable destructive capability in the form of a pleasant woman who drinks tea and makes small talk about the weather while casually discussing the annihilation of entire civilizations. In the grand tapestry of galactic history, this would come to be known as the day the universe learned to take humans seriously. And somewhere in the diplomatic quarters of the station, Captain Thasara Krivnik was putting the kettle on for another cup of tea, completely unaware that she had just single-handedly prevented approximately 17 different interstellar wars and earned humanity a reputation that would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come. After all, there was nothing quite like a good cup of Earl Grey to wash down the taste of existential terror.